So as talked about in the previous video, during the Elizabethan age, theater had reasserted itself as the dominant form of popular entertainment. Now what that meant was that for the first time in history, working in the theater had gone from a part-time hobby into a full-blown profession. We had seen the genesis of this with the traveling companies of the Commedia dell'arte, but what we see here is it take on a much larger and a much more organized form. So now, acting, playwriting, managing a theater company, these were now considered full-time professions, something a person could apprentice in and grow into. During the Elizabethan era, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of different acting companies all throughout England, all competing for the best playwrights, the best actors, and, of course, most importantly of all, the audience. What we'll be taking a look at in this video is the makeup of those theater companies. We'll also talk some about the most famous example of one of these companies, as well as the most famous actor of that time period. So before we take a real deep dive into the organizational makeup of these acting companies, let's talk just a little bit about some of the basic facts going into them. First of all, any of the legitimate acting companies, and by that I mean the very profitable, the very famous ones, they were all named after their patrons. We saw the genesis of this way back when we were looking at the Middle Ages, when the cycle plays would be sponsored by whatever trade union was most affiliated with whatever story they were telling. So that was the first real example of a play having sponsorship. Then, if you recall, when we were looking at the Italian Renaissance, in that era, we talked about artists finding rich sponsors, people who would pay for their work and then be able to brag to their friends that, hey, I sponsored that Leonardo da Vinci painting. Well, that comes back here in the Elizabethan era, where members of court, meaning the higher-ups, the lords and ladies and whatnot, would take a liking to a theatrical company and would sponsor it, therefore having the company named after them. This served the exact same purpose as naming a football stadium after the company that built it does. It creates brand awareness. People knew who that lord's name was, especially if the company was of any kind of note or prominence. The companies usually had about 25 members. Some of these were permanent members, and some were part-timers who would filter in and out between companies. So let's take a look at the different levels of employees that these acting companies would have. So at the very top of these theater companies were what we call the shareholders. These were the higher ups that actually bought a percentage of ownership of the company, and they were the first to receive any kind of percentage of the profits. Now that sounds great, but what that also meant is that they were the ones taking the real financial risks. It was up to them to find a theater, rent the space, hire the actors, publicize the performance, and try to get people in. So while it is true that they were the first to receive the financial compensation, they were also the ones taking all of the financial risk. So just under the shareholders would be the group known as the hired men, or the hirelings. These were actors who were contracted for one production and were not promised or guaranteed to any one theater company. They would filter between them, playing a part here, a part there, usually playing about the mid to supporting character roles, as the shareholders traditionally would be the ones playing the main characters. We see a very interesting hierarchy itself within the hirelings. These folks could range anywhere from just new people trying to get into the business. They could be folks who are just doing it as a part-time means of employment, to folks who were very highly sought after. Salary was determined by, of course, these factors. If a famous actor came around and wanted to be in your show, of course you'd pay him a higher amount. People often note when they're looking at Elizabethan works that there's a lot of words in it. It is long, and the guys go on and talk for long periods of time. Well, that's because some of these higher-ups in the hirelings would demand greater parts, or sometimes they would be paid by how many lines they had, so of course they would demand more lines. What we also see in the hirelings is kind of like we saw in the commedia companies. We see actors who specialize in specific roles. So if you needed someone to play a cowardly soldier like a Falstaff, you would call this guy. If you needed someone to play the older woman, you would call this guy. The third tier of personnel that we'd find in an acting company, these were the apprentices. So these were young performers who were training to learn the profession, much like you would find in just about any other trade of the time. Somebody would come to an established company and offer themselves as an apprentice to the shareholder. And these young men would do basically all of the grunt work that nobody else wanted to do. They were responsible for going out and putting the posters up or cleaning the theater after the show was done. For this, they would receive room and board, they would receive training in acting, they would receive experience, the hope being that by the time the young man came of age, he would be able to take over the running of the company when the shareholders decided they were ready to retire. So the company would continue on and be run in essentially the same way without any real disruption. So yeah, you started at the bottom, but the hope being that you would either A, take over the company when the time came, or you would be able to set out on your own and start your own company, and then you'd get an apprentice to do all of the grunt work you didn't want to do. These days we call people like that in the theater interns. One other important fact to remember about the Elizabethan era, this is nothing new to us as we have seen this all throughout history, but it is never quite as emphasized as it has been during the Elizabethan era. And that is that all of the roles in all of the productions were always played by men. So older men would play the older women, and the young girls, the Juliets, the heroes, would be played by 13, 14-year-old boys. It was deemed immoral for a woman to appear on stage. Think about that for a second, that at this time, in this place, by this society's standards, it was more immoral for a girl to appear on stage playing a girl than it was to have a man in drag pretending to be a girl. This was an incredibly reinforced law in that society. If a woman was found to have participated in a stage production, the consequences were very, very harsh. The theater would be closed down. Most likely, the shareholders who allowed it to happen would either be very harshly fined or imprisoned. The woman would definitely be imprisoned. Their family would be fined or possibly imprisoned. So they were not kidding around with this. They did not want to see a woman on stage playing a woman. As such, these young men whose job it was to play the romantic leads in some of these plays, became some of the most sought-after actors amongst the hired men. They were usually among the best paid. You had to make sure you had a strong female lead for some of these shows, so you needed the very best. It also bears noting that for a lot of these boys, their careers were sadly very brief, because, as we all know, as it must come to all young men, eventually puberty was going to hit, and their voices were going to drop, the beards were going to become more prominent, and you wouldn't be able to play those female roles anymore. So either you would have to transition from playing the younger female roles to the older female roles, the Juliet's nurse or things of that nature, or you would have to transition into the male roles. Or if you weren't able to do that, your acting career was essentially over. Let's briefly take a look at the most famous theater company from that time, the Lord Chamberlains Men. Now, we have already discussed them when we were discussing the different types of theater. They operated out of the Globe Theater and are most notable because they were the acting company of William Shakespeare. The Lord Chamberlains Men, so called because they were sponsored by Henry Carey, Lord Hudson, the Lord Chamberlain, and as we've discussed, these companies were named after the Lord that sponsored them. Famously, their shareholders included William Shakespeare, whom we will get into in much greater detail later on, actor Richard Burbage, whom we already discussed when we were discussing the theaters of the Elizabethan era, but who we're going to talk a little bit more about here in a second, and an actor by the name of Will Kemp. Will Kemp was best known for playing a clown. One of the things we talked about in the introductory video is how the Elizabethan playwrights completely abandoned the rules of the neoclassics, especially those of genre, where comedy and tragedy could not mix. Elizabethans mixed comedy and tragedy all the time, and you see it a lot in the works of Shakespeare. A lot of his tragedies have a fool character or a clown character, or out of nowhere there will come a comedic monologue. Now, there are a multitude of theories as to why that is, and we will get into that later on. But the predominant theory is because Will Kemp, being a clown and being one of the shareholders of the Lord Chamberlains Men, of course would demand a juicy role for himself in all of the production. So of course there would be a fool in King Lear. There would be the porter in Macbeth. There would be these comic monologues or comic characters within these tragedies. So the Lord Chamberlains Men was the most profitable. It was the most famous of all of these Elizabethan theater companies. So famous, in fact, that in 1603, the troupe was taken over and King James I became their patron. So they were so good and so well known that they had to be the king's personal theater company. And in 1603, they changed their name from the Lord Chamberlains Men to the King's Men. To wrap up here today, let's talk about the gentleman who was one of the shareholders of the Lord Chamberlains Men in just a little bit more detail, and that is this gentleman, Richard Burbage. Now, we've talked a bit about Richard Burbage already when we were discussing the Elizabethan theaters. His family built and owned just about all of them. He and his brother Cuthbert built just about all of them. But the other important thing about Richard Burbage is that he was considered the greatest actor of the Elizabethan age. He was highly sought after for performances. Why we remember him specifically, aside from his ownership of the theaters, is that he is most likely the person who originated most of Shakespeare's most iconic roles. To the best of our knowledge, Burbage was the first one to play Hamlet, King Lear, Othello. We believe he might have played Romeo at one point, but all of these great roles that every famous actor today is desperate to play, we believe Burbage played most of them first. Okay, so before we close out, there are a couple of points I want to make about that always interesting factoid that it was young men who were playing all of the women in the Shakespearean and Elizabethan productions. Whenever this point comes up, there are usually two questions that immediately jump into people's minds, and I want to address those questions here. So the first question that most people ask is, and they didn't care that it was two dudes up there playing Romeo and Juliet? And the answer is no, they really didn't. As we've discussed, first off, it was considered immoral. That was just the moral code of their time. This wasn't something that came out of nowhere. Men had been playing women's roles since the very beginning. Commedia dell'arte was kind of odd in that way, in that it actually had women playing women. It would have been seen as kind of an oddity of the time. But for that time period, this was the norm. It had never been any other way. The other thing that you have to remember, and this is something that modern audiences have a hard time grasping, is that the plays of that time, and again, this goes all the way back to the Greeks, the plays of that time were not interested in trying to convince you, the audience, that what you were seeing was real. Plays of that time were very aware that they were plays, and the audience was very aware that they were watching a play. So things like being able to see the strings, or being able to see the Deus Ex Machina as it lowered somebody down from heaven, the audience didn't care about that. They knew it was fake. They weren't trying to be convinced that it wasn't. So no, they really didn't care that they were watching a young man in a dress playing Juliet, because they knew the story wasn't real. So why should it bother them? The concept of realism and trying to convince the audience that what they were seeing was a slice of life would not come along till centuries later. So that's the first thing you really have to keep in mind. To them, this was normal. They knew what they were watching was a play. They knew these people were not actually the people on stage. And the people on stage were not trying to convince them that they were. This is why the acting of this time is all very big and very presentational. There was not a call for, we have to be realistic and find the subtleties. No, it was very big. The emotions were very big. The performance was very big. So that's the first question. The second question that, of course, comes up, and it's only natural when it does, is, well, how did they kiss? Well, I will demonstrate for you how they kissed. And it'd be much easier if I had another person here, but I don't, so I'm going to have to just kind of do this on my own. So, hand up. Pretend that this is the hand of the other actor. Kissing. That's how they would represent kissing in Elizabethan theater, is hands up and hands touching. That would be representative of the kiss. Think about it. Think about Romeo and Juliet. How much in that script does talk of hands come up? Oh, she puts a hand to her cheek. Oh, if I were a glove upon that hand. Yeah? Yeah? Bet you never noticed that before, and now you can't help but notice it. You are welcome.